London in the year 1792 was a city of brilliance and shadows, of powdered wigs still clinging to tradition, and of whispered talk about revolutions across the Channel. The carriages rattled endlessly through cobbled streets, horses striking sparks against stone as they carried noble families from one grand house to another. The air was alive with expectation that winter, for Parliament was in session, and Westminster, both in its chambers and its drawing rooms, shone with uncommon intensity. It was here, amid glittering banquets and music-filled halls, that Lady Charlotte Harrington took her first steps into the world that promised to shape her future. She was 19 years old, the second daughter of the Earl of Harrington, and much remarked upon in polite society. Charlotte had been raised in the comfort of her family's residence in Grosvenor Square, under the careful direction of her mother, who believed that a daughter's education was measured not only in music and languages, but also in the composure with which she carried herself in every circumstance. Charlotte had been taught to play the harp and the pianoforte, to speak French with ease, and to recite verses of poetry that suited both drawing-room entertainment and quiet reflection. She read widely, sometimes beyond what her mother approved, and often sought the company of books rather than that of her peers. Her beauty was the subject of much admiration, though Charlotte herself thought little of it. Her features were delicate, her eyes a deep gray that seemed to alter with the light, and her hair a soft chestnut that caught glimmers of copper under the candles. Her manner was reserved, but not cold, and her intelligence gave her an air of quiet assurance. It was no surprise to anyone when whispers spread that she was to be betrothed to one of the highest peers of the realm, William, Duke of Ashbourne. William's reputation preceded him wherever he went. He was a man of immense wealth, with estates stretching across several counties, and influence in political circles that few could rival. His demeanor was reserved, almost severe, and though some said his silences were intimidating, others praised him for dignity and self-control. He had returned from his travels abroad only a few years earlier, and had quickly established himself as a figure of consequence at court. His hand was sought by many ambitious families, yet it was Lady Charlotte whom he had chosen, or at least appeared to. Their betrothal was spoken of as nearly settled, though no official announcement had yet been made. Charlotte herself regarded the Duke with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. His manners were impeccable, his presence commanding, yet he revealed so little of his inner thoughts that she sometimes felt as though she gazed at a marble statue rather than a man. Still, her upbringing had prepared her to see restraint as a sign of strength, and her mother reminded her often that love was a luxury rarely granted to those of high station. Respect, stability, and duty were virtues far more enduring. She therefore silenced her doubts and looked toward her future with both resignation and hope. It was in the candle-lit halls of Westminster, during the height of the winter season, that Charlotte's expectations came to rest. The great ball that was to be held promised to bring together the most distinguished families of London. The invitations had been dispatched weeks in advance, each sealed with the crest of the host family, and anticipation grew steadily as the evening approached. For Charlotte, the ball meant more than a night of music and dancing. It was understood within her family that this would be the evening when her betrothal would be acknowledged, if not publicly declared. On the day itself, preparations began early. Charlotte's maid dressed her with careful precision, lacing her into a gown of pale ivory silk embroidered with silver thread that caught the candlelight with each movement. Her mother supervised every detail, from the placing of a pearl necklace at her throat to the arrangement of her hair into soft curls adorned with a single white feather. Her father, though less demonstrative, expressed his satisfaction with a nod, proud of the prospect that his daughter would soon be elevated to one of the highest titles in the land. As the hour drew near, the family carriage carried them through the lamp-lit streets toward Westminster.
The night was clear and cold, their breath misting in the air, as footmen held lanterns aloft and opened the doors for the stream of arriving guests. From within the carriage, Charlotte glimpsed the tall windows of the hall glowing with golden light, the silhouettes of dancers already passing before them. Her heart quickened, for she knew that every gaze inside would turn upon her, and every whisper would measure her composure. Within the hall, splendor reigned. Chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles, their reflections scattering across mirrors and polished floors. The air was perfumed with roses and warmed wine, while violins attuned in anticipation of the evening's first dance. Gentlemen in dark coats and white cravats bowed low before ladies in gowns of satin and velvet, their laughter mingling with the strains of music. Titles were exchanged as though they were coins, each name carrying weight in the balance of power and prestige. Charlotte entered at her father's side, her mother just behind. The crowd parted with curiosity, for though many young ladies adorned the room, it was Charlotte who drew the greatest attention. Whispers stirred at once. There was the Earl's daughter, the one rumored to be destined for Ashbourne. Fans fluttered, and eyes followed her progress across the room. She held her head high, as she had been taught, allowing no trace of her inner nervousness to mar her expression. Her gaze, however, searched for one man alone, and soon she found him. William, Duke of Ashbourne, stood across the hall, his figure unmistakable. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark coat cut to perfection, his powdered hair tied back with understated elegance. Unlike others who smiled or gestured in greeting, he remained composed, his expression unreadable. His eyes, cold as polished steel, were fixed upon her, watching her every movement as she advanced. For an instant the hall seemed to fade around her, the music dimmed, the chatter stilled. Charlotte felt the weight of his regard, and the promise it carried. All her hopes, her fears, and the expectations of her family converged in that single gaze. She had been taught that her destiny rested in this man's hands, that her dignity and her future would be secured by his word. And now, at last, the moment approached when all would be decided. As she entered the ballroom, under 1,000 gazes, the Duke's stern eyes searched for her, his expression unreadable. The orchestra had just begun the measured strains of a country dance, bows drawing smooth across strings. When the Duke took a deliberate step forward, conversation hushed in the vicinity of his progress, for William of Ashbourne was not a man accustomed to idle gestures. His tall figure cut a severe line through the shifting clusters of guests, his expression grave, his every movement commanding attention. Eyes followed him as though the very rhythm of the evening depended upon his course. Charlotte, standing with her parents, felt the familiar thrum of nervous anticipation quicken within her. She was aware of the stares that gathered upon her, and of the murmured exchanges fanning outward like ripples across water. She held her fan tightly, the pearl handle pressing against her gloved palm, and lifted her chin with practiced grace. This, she believed, must be the moment when her family's hopes would find their fulfillment. The Duke reached her at last. He bowed, not deeply, but with the formal precision that left no fault to be found. Her father inclined his head in return, her mother curtsied, and Charlotte, her heart quickening, lowered her eyes only for a moment before meeting his steady gaze. His hand extended toward her, a gesture both simple and commanding, as though inviting her to step forward into her fate. A hush spread across the hall as the crowd instinctively gave way. Those who had been preparing to dance paused mid-step, their movements faltering, until the great space at the center of the ballroom lay open before them. The light of the chandeliers shimmered on polished marble, and the air seemed to hold its breath. William led Charlotte into the center. The musicians hesitated, bows hovering over strings, uncertain whether to proceed. A murmur passed among the guests, spreading swiftly until silence pressed upon them all. Charlotte felt the weight of countless eyes, the judgment of lords and ladies, matrons and maidens, each one poised to witness the seal of her destiny. The Duke turned toward her, his face composed but curiously pale. For a fleeting instant she thought she saw hesitation flicker in his expression. She told herself it was merely her imagination, for surely this was the moment he would declare before all assembled that she was to be his Duchess. Her breath caught as she prepared to receive words that would alter her life. When he spoke, however, his voice cut across the silence with a clarity that chilled her. The words, delivered without tremor or haste, fell heavy upon the polished floor. She would never mean anything to him. At first, Charlotte scarcely comprehended what she had heard. Her heart, suspended between anticipation and dread, seemed to falter. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable slicing into the expectation she had carried so long. A gasp broke from the crowd, then another, until the room was alive with startled exclamations. Fans snapped open to conceal expressions of shock, and whispers rushed through the assembly like the hiss of wind through trees. Charlotte stood motionless, her face draining of color.
The hall blurred before her, lights and shadows swimming together, though she forced herself to remain upright. She clung to composure as to a fragile thread, though the thread trembled under the strain. The silence that followed the Duke's pronouncement seemed endless, broken only by the rustle of silk and the uneasy shifting of polished shoes upon marble. The Duke did not falter. His posture remained unyielding, his gaze fixed, as though the cruelty of his declaration bore no consequence. He offered no explanation, no softening phrase, only the words that shattered her dignity before all of London's nobility. The musicians, uncertain, lowered their bows altogether. The dance had died before it began. A lady near the front stifled a laugh, quickly masked behind her fan. Another whispered sharply into her companion's ear, eyes darting toward Charlotte with a mixture of pity and malicious triumph. Gentlemen exchanged knowing glances, their lips curved in wry amusement. The matrons, less discreet, shook their heads and murmured to one another of disgrace and misfortune. Every sound, every glance, pierced Charlotte like the prick of 1,000 pins. Her parents, too, were struck dumb. Her father's features stiffened with a sternness that betrayed both anger and humiliation, while her mother's hand clutched her fan so tightly the ivory frame creaked beneath the strain. Neither spoke, for what could be said before such a company? They too were prisoners of the moment, bound by the chains of public exposure. Charlotte's breath came shallow, her vision tightening to the unyielding face of the man who had cast her aside. She searched for some sign, some hint that it was a mistake, a cruel jest, anything other than the blunt dismissal it appeared to be. Yet William of Ashbourne stood unmoved, his words hanging in the air like a blade suspended above her. Around them, the ballroom pulsed with restless energy. The lords and ladies of London had been granted a spectacle they would recount for weeks, each detail embroidered with relish. Already the whispers began to swell, speculation weaving through the crowd, judgment settling with finality upon her shoulders. Where once they had admired, now they watched with avid curiosity, eager to see how she would fall. Charlotte's composure wavered, though she forced herself to remain upright. Her lips parted, but no words emerged, for none could be found. The betrayal was too stark, the humiliation too complete. Her heart, once filled with uncertain hope, now echoed with the cold emptiness left by his rejection. She felt as though the very ground beneath her had shifted, leaving her suspended in a void. The silence pressed heavier still. Even the air seemed reluctant to stir, as though all creation had paused to witness her disgrace. She longed for escape, for darkness, for any refuge from the piercing eyes that surrounded her. Yet escape was impossible, for she stood in the center of the hall, a spectacle displayed before every noble family of London. As the crowd parted in uneasy murmurs, Charlotte realized she stood utterly alone in the very hall where she was meant to be celebrated.
Charlotte's steps faltered as she withdrew from the blaze of chandeliers into the corridor beyond, the sound of her skirts dragging faintly against marble floors. The hum of voices, once deafening, faded behind her, though its echo remained in her ears like the dull roar of waves. Her parent's hand had briefly steadied her, guiding her away from the scene with measured dignity, but he spoke not a word. Her mother, pale and rigid, followed close, her fan held tight as though it were a shield. No comfort was offered, no protest raised, for the sting of public shame pressed heavily upon them all. In the privacy of the carriage that bore them back to Grosvenor Square, silence ruled. The gas lamps outside cast fleeting glows through the window, striking Charlotte's face in pale intervals, while the sound of hooves beat a steady rhythm against the cobblestones. Her father stared straight ahead, his jaw set hard, while her mother occasionally adjusted her gloves as though preoccupied with trifles. Charlotte sat between them, hands clenched in her lap, her throat aching with the effort of restraint. Not a word passed her lips, for she knew that to speak now would bring no solace. When they arrived home, the heavy doors closed behind them with an echo that filled the hall. Servants appeared to take cloaks and lanterns, their eyes discreetly lowered, though Charlotte sensed their curiosity. She ascended the stairs quickly, her slippered feet scarcely making a sound on the carpet, and sought the solitude of her chamber. Once the door closed, she leaned against it, trembling, her chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. At last the tears came, silent at first, then fierce, staining her cheeks and dampening the silk of her gown. She moved towards the looking-glass, the one that had often reflected her careful poise and her mother's pride. Now it showed her pale face, eyes swollen with grief, lips trembling with unshed words. She scarcely recognized herself. The pearls at her throat gleamed coldly, reminders of an expectation that had turned to ashes. With sudden force, she unclasped them, the string falling to the floor, pearls scattering with faint taps against the polished boards. She watched them roll away into corners, as though her very dignity had scattered beyond reach. The following morning brought no relief. London, with its ceaseless appetite for spectacle, had already begun to whisper. Those who had witnessed the scene at Westminster carried it into every drawing-room, every promenade, every whispered exchange in Hyde Park. The tale, embroidered with each telling, painted Charlotte as pitiable, foolish, or worse. Some said she had presumed too much upon the Duke's favor.
Others hinted at some hidden fault that had caused his rejection. None spoke with kindness. When Charlotte ventured to church with her family on Sunday, the weight of those whispers pressed heavily upon her. She felt eyes upon her as she knelt in the pew, eyes that pretended devotion, yet glanced sidelong with curiosity. Her ears caught the rustle of fans, the murmurs quickly stifled, the pitying sighs cloaked in hymns. She kept her gaze upon the prayer book, though the words blurred and swam, offering no comfort. Her mother walked beside her afterward with rigid posture, her silence sharpened by humiliation. Her father's steps were heavy, his brow dark with unspoken anger. Charlotte herself remained silent, for she knew no explanation would soothe the sting of disgrace. The sound of wheels upon gravel, as their carriage drew them away from the churchyard, seemed louder than usual, as though to remind her of every gaze that had followed them. In the days that followed, Charlotte avoided company. She retreated to her chamber, where the heavy curtains dimmed the winter light, or wandered the garden when the weather allowed. There, among the bare branches and fallen leaves, she sought solace, though it was scarce to be found. The wind carried a chill that seeped into her bones, and the earth, damp and lifeless, mirrored her own spirit. She would sit upon a stone bench, her hands clasped tightly, her thoughts circling endlessly around the humiliation that had struck her down. At times she would recall the exact moment in the ballroom, the stillness of the air, the chandeliers blazing overhead, the eyes of the assembly fixed upon her. She would remember the Duke's face, so composed, so unyielding, and the words spoken without tremor. Each recollection pierced anew, leaving her breathless with pain. She would cover her face with her hands as though to shield herself from a vision that could not be erased. Her tears came in private, unshared, for her pride forbade her from revealing weakness. Yet the silence of her chamber echoed with her grief, and the solitude of the garden gave voice to her despair. The books she once loved lay unopened upon her desk, their pages offering no escape. The harp in the corner stood silent, its strings untouched. Even the mirror she avoided, unwilling to see the reflection of her fallen dignity. Thus the days passed, heavy with sorrow. Each morning dawned with the faint hope that time might dull the sting, yet each evening closed upon the same weight pressing upon her heart. She felt trapped within an invisible prison, bound not by walls, but by the cruel judgment of society. Every glance she imagined, every whisper she overheard, seemed to confirm that she was ruined. One afternoon, as the pale winter sun slipped behind the bare trees, Charlotte sat alone in the garden. The air was sharp with cold, her breath visible as she exhaled, her cloak wrapped tightly around her. Yet the chill seemed to settle within her rather than without. She stared at the frozen ground, her thoughts heavy, her spirit bowed. The crunch of footsteps upon gravel reached her ears, breaking the stillness. She did not look up at once, for she wished no company, no intrusion upon her solitude. Yet the sound drew nearer, measured and deliberate, until at last she raised her eyes. There, standing at the edge of the path, was the familiar figure of her aunt, Lady Margaret. Her presence, strong and unyielding, broke the silence that had bound Charlotte in her grief. Lady Margaret stood with the calmness of one who had long ceased to fear society's judgment. Her dark cloak, lined with fur, fell about her in heavy folds, and the winter wind tugged faintly at the edges of her bonnet. She did not speak at once. Instead, she studied her niece with a steady gaze that seemed to see through the mask Charlotte tried to maintain. The garden, stripped of its summer bloom, lay silent around them, its branches bare against the pale sky. Charlotte rose reluctantly, uncertain whether she desired conversation. Her heart still ached with the weight of humiliation, and the thought of discussing it aloud threatened to deepen her pain. Yet her aunt's presence carried a kind of authority that was difficult to resist. Margaret walked forward, the gravel crunching beneath her boots, and seated herself upon the same stone bench Charlotte had just vacated. She patted the empty space beside her, a simple invitation that Charlotte could not ignore. For a time, the two women sat in silence. The distant caw of a crow echoed across the fields, and the faint rustle of branches stirred in the breeze. Charlotte drew her cloak closer, the cold pricking at her skin. She waited, her breath unsteady, knowing her aunt's words would come when she deemed the moment right. Margaret was not a woman who spoke carelessly. Her opinions, once given, bore the weight of both experience and conviction. At last Margaret turned her gaze fully upon her niece. Her eyes, sharp yet not unkind, held no trace of pity. Instead, they reflected a quiet strength, as though she sought to impart it to Charlotte by mere presence. She observed the pallor of the young woman's cheeks, the tension in her shoulders, the heaviness in her expression. Charlotte lowered her eyes, unable to meet such scrutiny, for she felt her shame laid bare without a word. Margaret's voice, when it came, was low and measured. She did not dwell upon the events at Westminster, nor did she speak the Duke's name. She did not recount the whispers that Charlotte had already heard whispered on every street. Instead, she spoke of dignity, of the strength that remains when all else is stripped away. Her words carried the firmness of someone who had weathered storms of her own, who had known society's cruelty and lived beyond its grasp. Charlotte listened, though at first with reluctance. The pain within her resisted comfort, clinging to despair as though it were the only truth left. Yet Margaret's words pressed gently but firmly against that resistance, reminding her that a woman's worth was not bestowed by the opinion of lords and ladies, nor extinguished by the scorn of a ballroom. Charlotte felt a stir of defiance, faint but real, deep within her chest. Her aunt's stories of the past were not offered as confessions, but as lessons. Margaret spoke of moments when her own pride had been tested, when society had turned her back and left her to find strength within. She described the freedom that lay beyond the fear of judgment, the peace found in refusing to measure oneself by the cruel scales of others. Each word carried weight, not because it was grand, but because it was lived. Charlotte raised her eyes again, meeting her aunt's steady gaze. The garden seemed less desolate, the winter air less oppressive. Though her grief had not vanished, it no longer pressed so mercilessly upon her. She began to understand that humiliation, however bitter, was not the end of her life. Something within her, something quiet yet unyielding, stirred as though awakening from long silence. The silence between them resumed, but now it was different. It was no longer heavy with despair, but filled with possibility. Charlotte did not speak, for she could not yet trust her voice, but her heart absorbed the strength her aunt offered. Margaret did not press her, for she knew the seed had been planted, and time would bring its own growth. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the chimneys of Grosvenor Square. The sound of footsteps upon the gravel path drew nearer, and Charlotte turned her head. A servant approached, his pace brisk, carrying a folded letter in his hand. His eyes flickered between the two women, uncertain whether to disturb their solemn moment. Charlotte remained still, her heart quickening at the sight of the letter, though she knew not its contents. Margaret's gaze did not waver, watching both her niece and the approaching messenger with calm composure. The servant bowed and extended the sealed letter toward Charlotte, its wax crest gleaming faintly in the dimming light.
Charlotte held the letter in her hand, but did not at once break the seal. The wax glimmered faintly in the pale light, the crest unrecognizable at first glance. Her fingers trembled as she waited, though her aunt's steady presence beside her reminded her that she was no longer as defenseless as before. Margaret urged her silently with a nod, and Charlotte slipped her thumb beneath the seal, opening it with deliberate care. The contents were plain and brief. Her father had decided she should spend the winter months at the family's estate in Kent, far from the talk of London and the whispers that followed her every step. Relief mingled with apprehension as she read the words. The countryside promised escape, yet it also meant leaving behind the familiar, even if the familiar had grown cruel. She folded the letter carefully, her eyes tracing the lines one final time, and then placed it into her lap with a steadiness she had not felt in many weeks. Margaret, observing her, approved with a faint smile, saying nothing more, for the decision had been made. Within days, Charlotte's trunks were packed, her gowns carefully folded, her books stacked with care, and the carriage readied for the long journey south. She left Grosvenor Square quietly, without fanfare, the heavy doors closing behind her as servants loaded the last of her belongings. Her parents did not accompany her. Her mother claimed ill health, and her father remained behind with parliamentary duties. Only Margaret traveled with her, the older woman seated opposite in the carriage, her presence a bulwark against the silence that might otherwise have consumed the journey. The road unwound beneath the wheels, each mile carrying Charlotte farther from London's relentless judgment. The winter landscape stretched wide and open, fields lying bare beneath a pale sky, trees stark against the horizon. The chill air seeped through the carriage, though blankets kept her warm, and the steady rhythm of hooves upon the frozen earth soothed her thoughts.
With each turn of the wheel, the memory of Westminster seemed to recede, though it did not vanish entirely. When at last they arrived at the estate in Kent, the sight brought Charlotte a measure of calm. The house, though less imposing than their London residence, carried a quiet dignity of its own. Its ivy-clad walls stood firm against the winter wind, and smoke rose from the chimneys, promising warmth within. The gardens lay dormant, but their outlines hinted at the beauty they would reveal come spring. Charlotte stepped from the carriage, her cloak drawn tight, and breathed deeply of the cold country air. It carried not the perfume of crowded drawing-rooms, but the earth's own scent, fresh and unadorned. Her days soon settled into a gentler rhythm. She walked in the gardens, despite the chill, her boots crunching upon frost-covered paths. She read in the library, where the fire crackled steadily in the hearth, its warmth wrapping her in quiet solitude. She played the pianoforte when the mood struck, filling the rooms with music that did not seek to impress, only to soothe. Margaret kept her company at meals and in conversation, guiding her gently without intrusion, reminding her that dignity could be rebuilt in silence as much as in action. It was during one of these walks in the gardens that Charlotte encountered Mr. Henry Whitmore. He was introduced by the steward of the estate, for Henry had long been acquainted with the family through his work in local matters. He was a man of scholarly bearing, his manner unassuming, his eyes attentive without being intrusive. He greeted her with courtesy, neither too bold nor too reserved, and spoke with the ease of one accustomed to thoughtful company. Charlotte noted at once the difference between him and the figures of London society. His words carried no hint of calculation, no undertone of ambition. He asked after her walks, her reading, the countryside, as though her opinions mattered rather than her reputation. Their conversation was brief that day, but it left an impression upon her, a sense of quiet respect that lingered long after he departed. In the days that followed, their paths crossed often. He visited the estate on matters of business with the steward, yet always paused to exchange words with Charlotte when occasion allowed. Sometimes they spoke of books, each offering reflections upon passages they had read. Other times they spoke of the land itself, the rhythm of seasons, the history of the countryside. Their exchanges were marked by simplicity, yet they carried a depth that surprised her. Charlotte found herself drawn to these conversations. They stirred in her a renewal she had not thought possible, a sense that her mind was valued, her presence welcome. She felt no need to conceal her thoughts, no fear of judgment in his quiet eyes. It was as though in his company she discovered parts of herself long overshadowed by expectation and duty.
One afternoon, as they walked beneath the bare branches of an ancient oak, Henry paused to remark upon the strength of the tree, its roots deep, its branches enduring the winter with steadfast grace. Charlotte listened, her gaze lifted to the sky through the web of branches, and she felt something stir within her. The image seemed to mirror her own heart, stripped of adornment, yet still standing, still reaching for light. That evening, as she sat by the fire in the library, Charlotte reflected upon the changes that had quietly taken hold. The wound of Westminster had not healed, yet it no longer defined her. Here among the fields and books, and in the company of one who regarded her with respect, she began to feel herself again. The silence of the countryside did not mock her. It offered space to breathe, to recover, to grow. Still, even as her spirit lifted, shadows lingered. The memory of William, Duke of Ashbourne, remained. She recalled his words, his unyielding face, the humiliation that had cut so deeply. The peace of Kent could not erase those moments entirely, yet for the first time since that night, she felt they no longer held absolute power over her. Something new, fragile, yet real, had begun to take root. Charlotte closed her book and gazed into the fire, the flames crackling and shifting, casting their light upon the room. Her heart was steadier than before, her spirit no longer bent beneath the weight of shame. She leaned back in her chair, allowing herself to breathe more freely, and for the first time in many weeks, a faint smile touched her lips. But just as that fragile sense of renewal took hold, the stillness of the evening was broken. A knock at the door of the library sounded, sharp against the wood, and a servant entered with lowered eyes. He carried a folded sheet of paper in his hand, his voice low as he announced that news had come from London. The word struck Charlotte with sudden force. News from London was seldom welcome, for it carried with it the voices she had sought to leave behind. She extended her hand, taking the paper with caution, her pulse quickening as she glanced at the seal. Margaret, entering quietly behind the servant, regarded her with steady calm, though Charlotte felt the old unease rise within her once more. Her fingers broke the seal slowly, unfolding the paper with care. Her eyes moved swiftly across the lines, her breath catching at the words. The letter bore a simple announcement, yet it carried weight enough to shatter her fragile calm. William, Duke of Ashbourne, was expected to attend a gathering not far from their estate. The news lingered in Charlotte's hands long after she had finished reading, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. She folded it carefully, pressing the crease with a deliberateness that betrayed her unease. The firelight flickered across her pale face, casting shifting shadows along the walls of the library. Margaret stood behind her chair, her expression composed, yet watchful, waiting for her niece to speak. But Charlotte found no words. Only the name written in the letter repeated in her mind, echoing with the weight of old humiliation. William, Duke of Ashbourne. The days that followed were restless. Though she tried to continue her routine of reading, walking, and quiet conversation with Henry, Charlotte could not banish the thought of the coming gathering. She had no desire to see William again, yet society moved with a rhythm that did not ask for her wishes. To remain absent would draw whispers. To appear would mean facing the very figure who had once undone her. Each hour seemed to press her closer to that moment, tightening around her like a knot. When the evening arrived, Charlotte dressed with care, though her heart resisted every touch of preparation. Her maid fastened the gown of pale blue silk chosen for the occasion, its folds falling gracefully to the floor. The mirror reflected a figure composed, every detail perfected. Yet Charlotte could not escape the knowledge that beneath the surface, her strength wavered. Margaret entered the room before they departed, her eyes sweeping over her niece with approval, but her words carried the firmness of command. Charlotte must remember that she carried her dignity within herself, not in the opinions of others. The gathering was held at a nearby manor, smaller than the grandeur of Westminster, but filled with equal measure of distinction. Candles glowed in every sconce, casting warm light upon paneled walls and polished floors. The air carried the fragrance of winter roses placed in tall arrangements, their petals pale against the dark green of leaves. Gentle music floated from the corner, soft enough to allow conversation to weave among the guests. Charlotte entered with Margaret at her side, her gaze steady, though her heart quickened beneath the calm exterior. A few familiar faces greeted her with polite nods, their expressions betraying curiosity more than warmth. She moved with measured steps, determined not to falter, though she felt the invisible weight of speculation pressing against her from every direction. Henry was present as well, offering her a kind word and easing her entrance into the room. His manner, as always, was respectful, his presence a quiet anchor amid the uncertain tide. Yet even his steadiness could not shield her from the moment she had dreaded. Across the room, William stood among a group of gentlemen, his figure as striking as ever in formal attire. His bearing remained austere, his expression reserved, and yet his presence commanded the space. Charlotte's breath caught before she mastered herself, forcing her gaze elsewhere. But it was too late. He had seen her. Their eyes met across the crowd, a brief but piercing connection that unsettled her composure. She turned slightly, accepting Henry's conversation with greater attention than before. Though the words scarcely reached her, her mind was occupied by the knowledge that William's gaze had lingered upon her, that he would not remain apart for long. She braced herself, knowing that retreat was impossible. The moment came sooner than she expected. The Duke approached, the guests parting naturally to make way for him, their curiosity sharpening with every step. When he reached Charlotte, he bowed with formal precision, his face betraying no emotion. She returned the courtesy with equal formality, her expression calm, though her pulse quickened. The exchange was brief, polite words spoken with the practiced ease of courtesy, yet beneath them ran a current neither could deny. Throughout the evening, their paths crossed again and again. He spoke with others, attended to his duties as a guest, yet his eyes returned to her with a persistence she could not ignore. Charlotte, in turn, maintained her composure, speaking with Henry, conversing with ladies and gentlemen of the county, yet her awareness of William never waned. Each glance, each silence, deepened the tension that hung between them.
Henry, perceptive though discreet, remained close, offering conversation that steadied Charlotte when the weight of scrutiny grew heavy. Yet even his kindness could not dispel the presence of the Duke. The atmosphere of the gathering seemed to shift with each encounter, as though the room itself anticipated some unspoken revelation. As the evening drew on, Charlotte found herself standing near one of the tall windows, the cold night visible through the glass beyond. The hum of voices filled the air, but for a moment she allowed herself the quiet of distance. Her reflection in the glass showed a face composed, yet her eyes betrayed the storm within. Behind her, footsteps approached. Steady and deliberate, she turned, already knowing whom she would see. William stood before her, the light from the chandeliers casting sharp lines across his features. His expression was unreadable, his composure unbroken, yet his presence carried a weight that set her heart unsteady. For an instant neither spoke, the silence between them louder than the murmur of the gathering. Charlotte steadied herself, refusing to allow the past to undo her once more. His words, when they came, were courteous and measured, offering nothing beyond the formality required. Yet his eyes lingered upon her with a depth that contradicted his restraint. Charlotte answered with equal composure, her tone calm, her posture dignified. Still she felt the air tighten around them, the weight of all that remained unspoken pressing against the thin veil of courtesy. The exchange ended as others approached, their presence dissolving the moment. Yet Charlotte felt the effect long after he withdrew. The gathering continued, the music resumed, the guests conversed as before. Outwardly nothing had changed, yet within her something stirred, an unsettling recognition that the story between herself and the Duke was not yet finished. As William prepared to take his leave, his gaze lingered on her longer than propriety allowed, leaving Charlotte unsettled by the unspoken conflict in his eyes. The weeks that followed the gathering were marked by an unsettling quiet, though beneath the surface of that quiet ran currents of rumor and speculation. Charlotte felt them long before they reached her ears. The glances exchanged between visitors, the tone of letters arriving from acquaintances in London, the faint but unmistakable pauses in conversation whenever her name was mentioned, all betrayed the same truth. Society had begun to speak of her again. She heard it first from Margaret, who never softened the truth, but delivered it with steady calm. People whispered that the Duke of Ashburn had been seen watching her too intently at the manor, that his presence near her was not the accident it appeared to be. Some said he regretted his earlier rejection, that he sought to claim her once more. Others mocked her as a woman so desperate she might forgive him, repeating cruelly that no dignity could survive a second humiliation. Charlotte listened, her heart hardening at the injustice, though her resolve was tested with each passing day. In Kent, the countryside offered little escape from these whispers, for they arrived even here, carried by letters, by visitors from London, by the restless need of society to embroider every tale. Each morning Charlotte opened her books and tried to lose herself in their pages, but the words swam before her eyes. Each walk through the frosted gardens brought her peace for a moment, only to be pierced by the thought that beyond these walls tongues wagged ceaselessly. She longed to live unseen, yet she was never free of their gaze. Meanwhile, William himself bore pressures of his own. Though Charlotte could not witness them, the effects reached her in fragments. Talk of his family urging him toward an alliance that would strengthen their influence. Reminders of obligations long woven into the fabric of his station. Behind each mention lay shadows of old betrayals, alliances that had once cost him dearly and left him mistrustful of affection. It was said he resisted, that he avoided commitments, that his family's frustration grew. Charlotte knew not the full truth, yet she sensed that the stern mask he wore concealed more than pride. Henry's presence during these weeks became a balm, though it was not enough to shield her entirely. His kindness never faltered. He sought her company in walks and in reading, offering conversation that steadied her troubled spirit. She valued him deeply, for he treated her with a quiet respect that asked nothing in return. Yet even in his company, she could not escape the restless shadow of the Duke. A glance, a silence, a word overheard, all reminded her that William's presence in her life was not ended, however much she might wish it so. The gossip reached a peak when a letter arrived from a cousin in London, its lines filled with sly insinuations. It told of drawing-rooms alive with speculation, of matrons insisting that Lady Charlotte Harrington's pride had softened, that she would forgive anything for the chance of a title. The cruelty of it struck Charlotte to the core. She tore the letter in silence, but its words burned within her long after the paper lay in fragments at her feet. Her aunt counseled strength, reminding her once more that society's voice could not define her worth. Yet Charlotte felt the walls of expectation closing in again, pressing upon her from all sides. To forgive William would be to confirm their whispers. To resist him would invite fresh ridicule if he truly sought to return. Either path seemed laced with peril. One evening, as she walked alone in the garden, the winter twilight deepening around her, she felt the weight of choice pressing more heavily than ever. The trees stood stark against the fading light, their branches bare, their silence echoing her own turmoil. She paused beneath the great oak where she had once walked with Henry, staring upward at its dark limbs, and wondered what course her life might take. The sound of wheels upon the frozen earth broke her reverie. She turned, startled, to see a carriage drawing up before the house. Its lamps glowed in the dusk, casting long beams across the graveled drive. The horses stomped and snorted, their breath visible in the cold air, while a figure descended from within. Charlotte's heart tightened as recognition struck her even before the door of the house opened to admit the visitor. William, Duke of Ashburn, had come unannounced, his tall figure unmistakable as he crossed the threshold with deliberate steps. Servants moved quickly to attend him, their surprise thinly veiled, while Margaret appeared at the doorway with composure that did not conceal her alertness. The air inside the house seemed to shift with his arrival, the quiet evening overturned by the weight of his presence. Charlotte remained where she was in the garden, her breath clouding in the chill, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and defiance. She knew that his presence here could mean only one thing. He sought her out directly, no longer content with glances or distant rumor. The moment she had feared and resisted had come at last. One of the servants, hurrying from the house, approached her across the gravel path. His voice carried the formality of duty, though his eyes betrayed curiosity. He announced that the Duke of Ashbourne had arrived and requested an audience with her father. The servant's words lingered in the cold evening air as Charlotte stood motionless beneath the bare oak tree. The world around her seemed to pause, the horses stamping at the drive, the glow of lamps flickering against the windows, even the faint rustle of the winter wind. All were suspended in the weight of what had just been spoken. The Duke of Ashbourne, who had once cast her aside before the eyes of London, now sought an audience with her father beneath her very roof. Her breath came shallow, the frost clouding before her lips. Every memory of Westminster returned in sharp detail, the chandeliers blazing above, the whispers swelling, the cruel certainty of his voice. She pressed her hands tightly together, as though to steady the trembling that threatened to betray her composure. Yet Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Dignity is carried within, and Charlotte forced herself to draw upright to meet what was coming without faltering. Inside the house, William's presence unsettled the stillness that had long reigned in Kent. Servants moved quickly yet quietly, preparing the drawing room, lighting additional candles, and arranging chairs with the urgency of those who sensed the gravity of their master's guest. Margaret entered first, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp, observing him with a guarded civility. William greeted her with the courtesy demanded of his rank, though his manner was heavier than mere formality. He was not the polished Duke of London's gatherings tonight, but a man who carried strain upon his shoulders. Charlotte entered only when she could delay no longer. The sight of him standing beneath the soft glow of candlelight struck her with a force she had not anticipated. His figure was as commanding as ever, his face composed, yet marked by an unfamiliar tension. For a heartbeat she felt again the sting of his words, the humiliation that had stripped her before all of London. Yet she steadied herself, her steps even as she crossed the threshold, her chin lifted with a quiet defiance. Their eyes met, and for the first time she saw in his gaze something other than the cold restraint he had always worn. It was not warmth exactly, but a heaviness, a struggle that belied the surface calm. He bowed with formality, and she curtsied in return, their gestures precise yet charged with the weight of unspoken memory. Her father entered then, his expression stern, his movements deliberate. He offered the Duke the courtesy due to his station, though the air between them was taut with unasked questions. The three of them, William, Charlotte, and her father, took their seats. Margaret, standing slightly apart, watchful as though she would not allow her niece to face this moment without witness. Silence lingered for several seconds, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. At last William spoke. His words were slow, deliberate, as though each carried the weight of confession. He spoke not of society, nor of reputation, nor of duty, but of his own failings. He admitted that his rejection of Charlotte had been born not of truth, but of fear. Fear of alliances once forged and broken, fear of betrayal that had left wounds upon him long before she had entered his life. He confessed that his cruelty at Westminster had been less a reflection of her worth than of his own weakness. Charlotte listened, her face calm, though her heart trembled with every syllable. The memory of her public disgrace surged within her, yet his voice carried an honesty she had never heard from him before. He spoke not as the impenetrable Duke, but as a man stripped of his defenses. His words, heavy and unpolished, revealed a torment that contradicted the cold mask she had once believed unbreakable. When he admitted at last that she had never left his thoughts, Charlotte felt her breath catch. He spoke of her strength, of the dignity she carried even in her suffering, of the way her presence had undone the walls he had built around himself. His confession was not grand, not clothed in the polished phrases of courtly declarations, but raw, almost desperate in its simplicity. Her father sat in silence, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed upon the Duke. Margaret, too, remained still, though the slight incline of her head betrayed her recognition of the gravity of his words. Charlotte herself found no immediate reply. Her thoughts whirled with pain and longing, with anger and something dangerously close to hope. The room seemed to press inward with the weight of her silence. William's eyes sought hers, not demanding, but pleading, as though her answer held the power to condemn or redeem him. Charlotte lowered her gaze for a moment, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. The humiliation he had inflicted upon her warred with the sincerity she now heard, the bitterness of the past against the truth of the present. At last she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with steadiness. She did not speak, for no words could yet encompass the storm within her. But the silence between them was different now, not empty, but heavy with meaning. Something had shifted, though she could not yet name it. The moment held, fragile and unbroken, until the sound of footsteps echoed suddenly from the corridor. The door to the drawing-room opened, and the presence of another entered, the world of society intruding once more upon their fragile exchange. The footsteps in the corridor faded into silence, leaving behind a heaviness that lingered in the drawing-room long after the door closed again. The fragile moment of confession had been broken, and though Charlotte's heart still echoed with the Duke's words, no resolution came. The evening ended with courtesy alone. Her father excused himself first, Margaret guided Charlotte from the room, and William departed soon after, his composure restored, though his eyes betrayed the weight of what had passed. In the days that followed, Charlotte carried his confession like an ember within her. It glowed faintly in the quiet hours, troubling her when she sought peace, stirring emotions she had thought long buried. She tried to occupy herself with reading, with music, with walks in the winter garden. Yet her thoughts returned always to his face in the candlelight, his voice stripped of pride, his words burdened with truth. She could neither forgive nor forget. She could only endure the turmoil that pressed upon her heart. When word arrived that a reception was to be held once more at Westminster, her first instinct was to refuse. She wanted no part in the glittering halls that had once been the scene of her deepest humiliation. Yet Margaret urged her to attend, reminding her that to absent herself would grant victory to those who whispered of her downfall. To walk again into that hall, to face those same eyes with her head held high, would be the truest sign of strength. After nights of restless thought, Charlotte agreed. The journey back to London weighed upon her spirit. As the carriage rattled across the frosted roads, she watched the familiar city come into view once more. The tall spires, the river carrying its slow winter current, the lamps already lit against the dusk. She entered her family's residence in Grosvenor Square with steady steps, though her heart quickened at every reminder of what awaited her. Servants hurried to unpack her trunks, her mother offered quiet words of encouragement, and Margaret never left her side. The night of the reception came swiftly. Charlotte dressed with deliberate care, choosing a gown of white satin that shimmered in the candlelight, its simplicity marked by dignity rather than ostentation. pearls circled her throat once more, though she wore them now not as a symbol of her family's ambitions, but as a quiet reclaiming of what she had once cast aside in grief. When she looked into the mirror, she saw not the trembling girl who had fled Westminster in tears, but a woman tempered by suffering, her gaze steady and unbroken. Westminster's halls glittered as they had before. Chandeliers blazed with countless candles, music swelled from the orchestra, and voices filled the air in eager conversation. Guests moved gracefully across the floor, their silks and satins catching the light. Yet beneath the polished surface, Charlotte felt the hum of curiosity. Eyes turned toward her as she entered. Fans fluttered to conceal whispers, and the air thickened with expectation. She walked with measured steps, her aunt beside her, her father just behind. She did not falter. William was there. She saw him at once, his figure unmistakable amid the throng. His bearing was as dignified as ever, yet his eyes betrayed the restlessness of a man no longer content with silence. Charlotte's pulse quickened, but she did not avert her gaze. Their eyes met across the glittering hall, and for a moment it seemed that all else faded. The music, the voices, the movement of the crowd, leaving only the weight of that unbroken gaze. The evening pressed forward. Charlotte exchanged courtesies with acquaintances, responded to polite inquiries, endured the faintly veiled remarks that carried more curiosity than kindness. Henry was present as well, offering her a word here and there. His respectful manner a reminder of the peace she had known in Kent. Yet William's presence overshadowed all, and with every passing moment Charlotte felt the air grow taut, as though the night itself awaited a reckoning. At last the moment came. William crossed the hall, the crowd parting instinctively to make way for him. His eyes never left Charlotte as he approached, his step steady, his face composed, but his purpose unmistakable. The orchestra faltered, the swell of music softening, as though even the musicians sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. He reached her side. Without hesitation, he took her hand, his touch firm yet reverent, and before the assembly of London's nobility, he bent and pressed his lips to hers. A silence fell upon the hall, so sudden and complete it seemed the world itself had paused. Fans froze mid-motion, conversations died on the lips of startled guests, and the blaze of chandeliers shone upon faces struck with astonishment. The kiss was brief, no more than the meeting of lips, yet it carried a force that shattered every pretense, every mask, every wall. It was a gesture reckless in its defiance, bold in its sincerity, impossible to mistake or deny. In that single moment, William laid bare what he had long concealed, and Charlotte felt the truth of it with a certainty that silenced the tumult within her. When he lifted his head, the hall erupted, not with music, not with dance, but with whispers, gasps, and the rustle of scandal racing from lip to lip.
The silence that had fallen upon Westminster's Hall after the kiss gave way to a tide of restless murmurs, the sound swelling like a wave against marble walls and gilded pillars. Yet Charlotte did not flinch. Her hand remained in William's, her gaze unwavering as she looked up at him. For the first time she saw no mask, no marble facade, no cold distance. His eyes, dark and steady, held nothing but unguarded truth around them. The nobility of London stirred in shock, but within that fragile circle of two, the world seemed to pause. Her father's stern gaze followed from a distance. Margaret's expression composed, though her lips curved with the faintest trace of satisfaction. Matrons whispered furiously behind their fans.
Younger ladies exchanged glances, half scandalized, half envious, and gentlemen tilted their heads in sharp appraisal. But Charlotte heard none of it. She felt only the warmth of William's hand enclosing hers, the weight of his gesture defying all that had once held them apart. The orchestra, after a moment's hesitation, resumed its music, though the notes trembled at first before regaining their rhythm. Conversation did not return so easily. The room remained charged, each guest aware they had witnessed a moment that would not soon be forgotten. Yet William, unshaken, turned to Charlotte with composure and newly born of resolve. He led her with quiet authority across the hall, his hand steady in hers, as though every eye upon them was powerless to diminish their step. The night ended with whispers still fluttering in corners, but Charlotte did not bow beneath them. She left Westminster with William at her side, his carriage following behind her family's. The city streets were hushed under the cold stars, the lamps burning steadily as the wheels rattled over cobblestones. For the first time since that fateful night months before, Charlotte felt the weight of humiliation lift, replaced instead by the trembling awareness that her life was shifting once more, this time toward something truer. The days that followed were filled with speculation. London did not rest. Its appetite for stories was insatiable. Yet instead of pity or ridicule, Charlotte now found herself the subject of fascination. The Duke who had once rejected her had before the eyes of the same court declared himself in a gesture no one could mistake. Whispers still carried cruelty, but they no longer cut her as they once had. She had been through the fire of shame and emerged not broken but tempered. William came to Grosvenor Square without delay. He did not cloak his visits in secrecy, nor did he offer half measures. He came openly, walking through the front doors with the dignity of his station, but leaving his pride behind. Charlotte received him in the drawing-room, the firelight warming the silence between them before he spoke. This time his words were steady, unadorned by excuse or hesitation. He asked not for forgiveness alone, but for her choice, whether she would walk beside him, not as an arrangement of families or a bargain of titles, but as the woman he loved. Charlotte listened in stillness, her hands folded, her eyes searching his face for any trace of the coldness she had once known. There was none. His confession at Kent, his kiss at Westminster, and his presence now before her father's hearth were proof enough. Her heart, long torn between pain and longing, found its answer at last. She lifted her gaze, her voice clear though soft, and chose him, not for the title, not for society's approval, but for the truth that bound them. Despite all, their union was not delayed. Weeks later, far from the glare of Westminster chandeliers, Charlotte and William were wed in the quiet grace of the countryside. The ceremony was held in a small chapel near his estate, its stone walls ancient, its windows filled with colored glass that caught the winter light. There were no throngs of curious nobles, no elaborate pageantry to satisfy society's hunger. Only family, a few loyal friends, and the stillness of sacred vows filled the space. Charlotte walked down the narrow aisle in a gown of ivory muslin, her veil light as mist, her steps steady with the calm of certainty. William waited at the altar, his eyes never leaving her. When her hand was placed in his, he held it with reverence, his voice steady as he pledged his devotion. Charlotte's reply was quiet yet sure, her heart speaking as much in silence as in words. When the vows were sealed, when his lips brushed hers once more beneath the arch of stone, there was no murmur of scandal, no weight of shame, only the quiet joy of two souls who had at last found their truth. Afterward they returned to Ashbourne's estate, its halls echoing with the newness of their life together. Gone were the whispers of London, gone the relentless eyes of court. The countryside welcomed them with its stillness, its fields lying in winter rest, its gardens waiting for spring. Charlotte discovered a freedom she had never known, walking among the paths not as a woman burdened by expectation, but as one who had chosen her fate. Their days unfolded with a rhythm marked not by duty alone, but by companionship. They walked together through the frost-tipped meadows, spoke long by the fireside in the evenings, and planned the renewal of the estate with care for both land and people. William's sternness softened in her presence, his reserve replaced by a quiet warmth that revealed itself in gestures more than words, the way his hand lingered at her back, the way his gaze sought his own across the room, the way the silence between them grew not heavy but comfortable. Charlotte, too, was transformed. No longer did she measure herself by society's scales. No longer did she fear the sting of judgment. She carried within her the memory of humiliation, yes, but also the strength that had risen from it, the dignity her aunt had once reminded her could never be taken. That strength shaped her now, guiding her as she stepped into her new life, not as a girl undone, but as a woman reborn. Spring came at last, and with it the first blossoms of the garden. Charlotte walked among them with William at her side, the sun soft upon the earth, the air filled with the scent of renewal. She paused beneath the great oak, its branches heavy now with fresh leaves, and looked upward. Months before she had stood beneath its bare limbs in despair. Now it spread above her in full life, a mirror of her own heart. William, following her gaze, said nothing, but his hand tightened around hers with the certainty of one who knew they had endured and emerged stronger. Charlotte looked out across the fields, her heart quiet yet full. She thought of all that had passed, the cruel words, the downfall, the whispers, the slow rebirth, the kiss before the court, and the vows spoken in the chapel. Each had shaped her, each had carved a path she could not have foreseen. She had been humiliated, yes, but humiliation had not destroyed her. It had led her here, to a life truer than any she had once imagined. To those who would listen, Charlotte offered her reflection. She spoke not of titles or wealth, not of the fleeting triumphs of society, but of courage, of the strength to endure humiliation and rise again, of the power of following one's heart even when the world demands otherwise. She reminded them that worth is not bestowed by approval nor diminished by scorn, but carried within. And so her story closed not with the cold blaze of chandeliers, but with the quiet warmth of freedom, of love chosen over fear, of dignity reclaimed. Charlotte, once broken beneath the gaze of society, stood now in the light of her own truth, her hand in William's, her heart unbound. The lesson of her life was simple yet enduring, that true happiness lies not in the approval of others, but in the courage to follow the path of love and authenticity, no matter the cost.
Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.